Madagascar just flipped the script. The president fled the country on a French military jet before even facing his people. The same army unit that once crowned him just joined Gen Z protesters calling out corruption. The question now isn't where he went, it's why the nation he ruled finally said no. Let's find out. It happened so fast that even the streets didn't have time to process it. One moment, Madagascar's president Andry Rajoelina was preparing to deliver a televised address, the kind meant to project calm, control, and confidence. The next reports began filtering through local media and foreign correspondents. The president had fled. Not resigned, not detained, fled. Gone from Antananarivo on a French military jet, reportedly after striking a discreet deal with Emmanuel Macron's office. The plane took off just before dusk, its flight path traced online by thousands watching in disbelief. The announcement sent a shockwave across the Indian Ocean nation. Rajoelina, the 51-year-old former DJ who had once branded himself as the youth president, had built an image of resilience, the man who returned to power after years in the political wilderness. But this time, he didn't fall in an election. He fell in an uprising. By the time his plane lifted off, the palace gates were already surrounded, not by rebels or armed enemies, but by civilians and soldiers waving the same flag. The silence from the presidential palace wasn't strategic, it was absolute. Hours earlier, the country had been preparing for a national broadcast. The presidency's Facebook page had announced that Rajoelina would address the nation at 7 p.m. local time. Antananarivo's residents were glued to their phones, expecting yet another carefully rehearsed speech blaming foreign influence or criminal elements. But 7 p.m. came and went. The screen stayed blank. No national anthem, no opening graphic, no presidential voice. Within minutes, rumors began to swirl on encrypted chat groups. He's gone. Soon after, Radio France Internationale (RFI) confirmed the unimaginable. The president had boarded a French military aircraft. Macron's government refused to comment, but the symbolism was impossible to ignore. The man who had repeatedly declared Madagascar's sovereignty now sought safety in the arms of its former colonizer. To many in the streets, it felt like the final betrayal. As news spread, crowds erupted outside the Antananarivo City Hall, where protests had been raging for weeks. Witnesses described scenes of euphoria mixed with disbelief. Soldiers from the elite CAPSAT unit, once the very backbone of Rajoelina's 2009 rise to power, climbed atop armored vehicles draped in the Malagasy flag. They weren't there to suppress anyone. They were celebrating with the people they had been ordered to control. The chants echoed through the square. "We will not sell our country again." By nightfall, social media was flooded with live footage. Civilians hugging soldiers, teenagers waving phones as flashlights, and mothers holding banners that read, "Power to the people." For a country long numbed by economic hardship, this was the sound of awakening. It wasn't chaos, it was catharsis. The military's demeanor was equally telling. Officers who once carried out presidential orders now moved as peacekeepers, blocking looters and ensuring hospitals stayed protected. "The army is with the people," one CAPSAT spokesman told a local journalist. "We are here to restore dignity, not destroy it." Those words marked the real beginning of the transition, one led not by political elites, but by conscience. But behind the chants and camera flashes, a darker question began to surface. How could a sitting president lose his power overnight, not to an organized opposition or a foreign invasion, but to his own people and his own protectors? How did a government so entrenched in control collapse without a single shot being fired? When a president flees, it's never because of one bad day. It's because of 1,000 bad days that finally collapse into one unbearable night. The fall of Andry Rajoelina didn't start with soldiers or speeches. It began quietly, in homes where candles replaced light bulbs, in markets where food spoiled for lack of refrigeration, and in the hushed anger of citizens who couldn't remember the last time their government delivered what it promised. For months, Madagascar's power grid had been collapsing under neglect and mismanagement. Blackouts were no longer inconveniences. They were daily rituals. Water shortages followed, deepening the misery. Hospitals ran on backup generators, small businesses shut down, and school children studied by phone flashlights. But the real breaking point came not from scarcity alone, it came from arrogance. On September 19th, 2 opposition lawmakers were arrested for planning a peaceful demonstration over the outages. That single act, the silencing of protest over basic survival, convinced the public that the government wasn't just incompetent, it was hostile. Social media lit up overnight. Within hours, young Malagasy citizens, students, activists, and even gig workers began coordinating online under one unifying phrase: Gen Z Madagascar. They didn't have money, political backing, or media coverage. What they had was something far more powerful: exhaustion. A collective fatigue that refused to be pacified by slogans or press conferences. When their posts began trending, they weren't calling for dialogue, they were calling for resignation. As protests swelled, the government responded the only way weak regimes know how: with denial and force. Police were deployed to disperse gatherings, tear gas filled the air, and officials went on state TV blaming criminal gangs for unrest. But the more they spoke, the less anyone listened. What Rajoelina's administration failed to grasp was that this was not an opposition movement. It was a generational revolt. These young protesters had grown up under the shadow of his rule. They were children when Rajoelina first seized power in 2009, teenagers when he lost it, and adults when he returned. For them, his second term wasn't a comeback. It was déjà vu, a recycled illusion of reform masking the same rot. The president's promise of modernization, digital jobs, infrastructure renewal, and anti-corruption drives had turned into photo ops and vanity projects. As days turned into weeks, Antananarivo's city center became the beating heart of the rebellion. Each night, new crowds gathered, chanting beneath flickering streetlights, holding cardboard signs that read, "Enough," in Malagasy and French. The police crackdown only amplified their message. Videos of brutality spread online, transforming anger into organization. People who once felt powerless began to realize they were the majority. But something about this movement was different from past uprisings. It wasn't about partisan politics. It wasn't about taking sides between elites. It was about reclaiming dignity. Protesters weren't asking for positions. They were demanding accountability. They didn't want to negotiate behind closed doors. They wanted to confront their leaders in daylight. By early October, the rallies had grown so large that the army could no longer ignore them. And that's where the story took its next turn. Because when the civilian voice grows too loud, history always pauses to ask, will the guns stay loyal to power, or will they remember they belong to the people? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. When crowds roar, regimes tremble, but they only fall when the guns change sides. That was the decisive moment Madagascar reached after weeks of defiance, the day when soldiers looked into the crowd and saw not enemies, but their own families. The same uniforms that once symbolized obedience suddenly became the armor of revolt. It started with whispers. Within army barracks, young officers began asking questions that used to be unthinkable. Why are we shooting at unarmed citizens? Who are we really protecting? These were not radical ideas. They were moral ones. And in a military built on hierarchy, morality spreads like wildfire once one brave voice dares to say it aloud. That voice came from the CAPSAT unit, Madagascar's most elite and influential military division. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were the same men who had once escorted Rajoelina to power during the 2009 coup. Their loyalty was legendary, but so was their pride. To them, the sight of soldiers firing into crowds of civilians felt like treason against their own oath. Then came the video, short, grainy, filmed in what appeared to be a dimly lit barracks, but powerful enough to shatter the illusion of control. A CAPSAT officer, flanked by fellow soldiers, stared into the camera and said with deadly calm, "Let us join forces, military, gendarmes, and police, and refuse to be paid to shoot our friends, our brothers, and our sisters." Within hours, it went viral across the island. You could almost hear the pulse of the nation shift. Soldiers stationed at checkpoints began lowering their weapons. Police officers who had spent days chasing protesters now shared food with them. Even gendarmes, once notorious for brutality, released a statement admitting to excesses and apologizing publicly for their actions. It was not just an apology, it was a declaration that the chain of command had broken. By the next morning, the entire power structure began to disintegrate. The Ministry of Defense went silent. Orders from senior generals were ignored. In some districts, local commanders openly sided with demonstrators, allowing marches to pass through secured zones unchallenged. What made this rebellion so remarkable was not its violence, but its restraint. Soldiers weren't attacking institutions or seizing state television. They were protecting civilians from chaos. Analysts later called it a moral coup. No tanks were surrounding the palace, no threats on airwaves, no ambitious general demanding power. Instead, there was unity, a rare fleeting moment where citizens and soldiers stood side by side under the same flag, demanding something purer than politics: accountability. The government, now paralyzed, tried one last desperate move, ordering loyalist forces to retake control of Antananarivo's city hall, where protesters had camped for days. But no one moved. A leaked radio transmission later revealed why. A CAPSAT officer had countermanded the order, telling units to hold positions and await new instructions. Translation: the army had just become self-governing, and that meant the president was no longer in charge. For many Malagasy citizens, this was the moment they realized the balance had finally tipped. Videos of soldiers embracing civilians spread faster than any press statement. You could see relief on faces that had been hardened by weeks of tear gas and fear. For once, the people and the military shared a cause, not to overthrow the nation, but to reclaim it. But while the nation rejoiced, one man's world was collapsing. Inside the presidential compound, panic replaced protocol. Advisors whispered of betrayal, ministers vanished, and Rajoelina himself reportedly spent hours on the phone with foreign allies seeking guarantees of safety. For a leader who once ruled with confidence, his isolation was complete. The army's defection was not just a political blow, it was an emotional one. It told every Malagasy watching that power no longer flowed downward. It rose upward, from the people themselves. Yet one question loomed large. With the guns now on the side of the streets, how would the president respond? Would he negotiate, surrender, or run? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. By the time the engines of the French military jet roared to life, the palace was already hollow. The president's guards had thinned out. The corridors, once echoing with advisors' chatter, now filled only with hurried footsteps and unanswered calls. Andry Rajoelina, the man who once proclaimed he would never abandon his people, was being escorted to an aircraft that symbolized the exact opposite: abandonment. The same night that soldiers stood guard with civilians outside the palace gates, their commander-in-chief was being quietly flown out under the watch of foreign soldiers. The decision was not spontaneous. Hours before his disappearance, senior French officials had reportedly reached out to coordinate a secure extraction. Officially, the justification was his dual French citizenship, a technicality that gave Paris both a reason and a pretext to act. Unofficially, it was about damage control. For France, the optics of a fallen ally being dragged through the streets of Antananarivo were intolerable. Better to extract him discreetly than let another African capital broadcast anti-French rage to the world. But inside Madagascar, this rescue was seen as betrayal layered upon betrayal. It wasn't just that Rajoelina fled, it was how he fled. In the eyes of his citizens, he didn't escape danger. He escaped accountability. The streets that had once celebrated his victory in 2023 now mocked him as a coward who ran to the very country he had accused of neo-colonial meddling. For many, the French aircraft wasn't just an evacuation vehicle. It was a symbol of the old power dynamic Africa has been trying to break for decades. As the news broke, the mood in Antananarivo shifted. There was no chaos, no violence, just silence, the kind that follows disbelief. People gathered around radios, waiting for clarification that never came. The presidential broadcast, promised hours earlier, never aired. His spokespersons vanished from television. Even the government's social media pages went dark, leaving only unanswered comments and confused emojis beneath the last scheduled post announcing his speech. It was as though the entire state had evaporated overnight. Meanwhile, eyewitnesses near the Ivato International Airport described an eerie scene. French military personnel were seen escorting vehicles through a secured gate, bypassing local customs and air traffic control. A convoy of black SUVs arrived around dusk, and within minutes, the plane lifted off, slicing through the gray evening sky. No official statement confirmed the destination, but regional flight trackers later showed a route toward the United Arab Emirates, possibly Dubai, where several ousted leaders have historically sought refuge. Inside the country, the effect was electric. Protesters, who had spent days demanding the president's resignation, suddenly realized they had achieved more than that. They had chased him from his own soil. The chants that once called for justice have now turned into cries of independence. It wasn't merely a political victory, it was psychological emancipation. For once, the people didn't need permission from the palace or Paris. They had taken their country back by standing still and refusing to yield. In foreign capitals, however, the narrative was more complicated. Western outlets framed Rajoelina's exit as a preventive measure to restore calm, a phrase that conveniently ignored who had caused the unrest in the first place. The French Foreign Ministry remained tight-lipped, releasing a vague statement about ensuring the safety of citizens during unrest. But African commentators saw right through it. This wasn't a humanitarian act, it was a geopolitical reflex. France had once again chosen to protect a client leader rather than face the moral consequences of its influence. Within Madagascar, the power vacuum deepened. The key ministers were nowhere to be found, leaving military officers and civilian representatives scrambling to maintain order. But something profound had shifted in the national psyche. For the first time in decades, the Malagasy people felt that authority did not need to descend from above. The soldiers who refused to shoot, the youth who refused to disperse, and the civilians who refused to fear had together rewritten what legitimacy meant. Still, one question lingered, echoing through the now leaderless capital. What comes after a revolution without a roadmap? Removing a ruler is one thing, rebuilding a nation is another. And as dawn crept over Antananarivo, the celebrations began to fade into contemplation. If power truly belonged to the people now, then so did the responsibility to shape what came next. For the first time in a generation, Madagascar stood without a president, without a functioning cabinet, and without fear. The same city squares that had once echoed with gunfire and sirens now filled with community meetings, speeches, and songs. Youth groups, civic leaders, even priests and imams gathered not to protest, but to plan. From those gatherings, a new narrative began to take shape, one that didn't start with politicians or generals, but with citizens asking themselves what kind of country they wanted to build next. That shift, from resistance to reconstruction, is what turned this moment from mere political collapse into the beginning of rebirth. The Gen Z activists who had once coordinated rallies on social media now started organizing cleanup drives and volunteer patrols to prevent looting. Soldiers who had joined the people continued to patrol the streets, but now as protectors rather than enforcers. For the first time, there was a shared sense of ownership. The government hadn't fallen into chaos. It had dissolved into a community. Yet amid this newfound unity, the challenges were enormous. Power stations still stood idle. Food distribution chains were fragile. The economy was in free fall after weeks of paralysis. And foreign investors, spooked by the images of soldiers siding with protesters, began pulling out. But this time, the Malagasy weren't waiting for outside approval. Civic coalitions began drafting open letters demanding a transitional council made up of youth representatives, religious figures, and regional governors, not political elites. That idea gained momentum fast. Within days, major labor unions and student organizations endorsed it. The message was clear: Madagascar would not trade one strongman for another. If this revolution was to mean anything, it had to dismantle the cycle of dependency and manipulation that had defined the country's politics for decades. The idea wasn't just to change who governed, it was to change how governance worked. Across Africa, the ripple effects were immediate. News outlets from Dakar to Nairobi hailed the Malagasy uprising as proof that young Africans could lead revolutions without descending into anarchy. Analysts called it the world's first Gen Z-led democratic uprising. But the real lesson wasn't just generational, it was moral. The movement had shown that the true weapon against tyranny was not violence, but conviction. Soldiers had refused orders. Citizens had refused lies. Together, they had stripped power of its fear. In foreign capitals, the event triggered nervous conversations. Western governments, accustomed to backing stability over sovereignty, now faced a new kind of African defiance, one that couldn't be bribed, threatened, or spun. The old playbook of installing friendly regimes suddenly looked outdated. If France thought flying Rajoelina out would contain the rebellion, it had underestimated something far larger, an African awakening driven by dignity, not diplomacy. Inside Madagascar, talk of elections began to surface, but this time, not as an immediate goal, rather as an eventual milestone. Civil society groups argued that holding a quick vote would only invite the return of corrupt elites. What the nation needed first, they said, was a foundation, reforms in the energy sector, anti-corruption laws, and constitutional guarantees to prevent dual citizenship leaders from ever holding the presidency again. The slogan spreading online captured the new spirit perfectly. Rebuild before we re-elect. And so, as the days passed, a sense of cautious optimism replaced outrage. Markets reopened, schools planned to resume, and artists began painting murals depicting the moment soldiers stood beside protesters, not as heroes, but as reminders that power can change direction when conscience intervenes. The nation still faced uncertainty. The path ahead was uncharted. But this much was clear. Madagascar was no longer afraid. Its people had discovered something stronger than authority: unity. And perhaps that is how revolutions should truly end, not with the triumph of one leader, but with the rise of a collective voice. When citizens stop waiting for saviors and start governing themselves, power ceases to be a privilege. It becomes a responsibility. So, as the sun rose over a nation reborn, one could almost hear the whisper carried across the Indian Ocean, a message not of chaos, but of clarity. Africa does not need guardians. It only needs faith in its own people. Do you think Madagascar's uprising marks the birth of a new kind of African democracy? One led by its youth, not its elites? Let us know in the comments section. Should African nations stop relying on Western rescue missions and handle their crises entirely on their own terms? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.